Hi, everyone. It's Carolyn Moor from the Modern Widows Club. And we have an interesting topic today called Is Faith Enough to Get Through Grief? And I have a friend and a very experienced speaker today, Blake Lasater. Thanks, Blake, for being on our call today.
Thank you, Carolyn.
So Blake and I go back about 21 years, really. I met Blake about 6 months after I became widowed. He was a pastor at a church in a small town in Arkansas. And then 10 years later, Blake himself became a widower. And his own personal experience, as well as with his professional experience, really plays into this topic. And it's certainly some of the questions, is faith enough, to get through grief, has really been something that we've talked about over the years. And so I asked Blake, so I just want to give you a little bit of background on Blake, just professionally. Blake, tell everyone like where you're from and where your background is, just professionally.
So I'm from Eureka Springs, Arkansas. I'm a United Methodist pastor for the last 20-something years. I'm losing track of that. I'm also a 14-year veteran of the U.S. Navy as a chaplain for Marines and sailors. And so in that time, I've had a lot of experience dealing with death and grief and widowhood and widowers. So that's more or less my professional background that I approach this with.
Well, you're being humble, and I'll say your degree, you actually have a double degree, both in history and philosophy, and then you have a master's of divinity, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really admire about you when I do ask you questions, especially biblical or spiritual questions, you always have a historical reference, which is actually really important. And then you tie that to scriptures where obviously we've talked a lot about widows and widowers and churches and pastors. And that's where this conversation sort of came up with, is faith just enough? Because I think that a lot of churches and why should churches and why should pastors really care about widows? Because you and I both know that there are so few widows ministries and outreaches out there. So I guess we can kind of start with, is faith enough? And is that really what pastors and churches believe?
I think there's a lot of mythology surrounding faith. It's almost like if you have enough faith, that somehow that exempts you from the trials and tribulations of life. And yet I know from my experience, that's just not true. That type of faith is never going to be enough to get you through a shattering life event like the loss of a spouse. I think that faith is, if you take it as trust in God, that faith will help you through this experience. Will it be enough? I mean, that's a hard question to answer, because there's so much bad theology out there that has been taught to us that if you just have faith, you'll be able to rise above all of it. But we need to take seriously in the scriptures that it says Jesus wept too at the grave of his friend. I think that's the shortest verse. Jesus wept, but he was crying over the death of his dear friend. And even on the cross, Jesus cried out, my God, where are you? Very much true that Jesus, as a human being, experienced the full range of our pain and suffering. So I think the church does a disservice to people when they try to sell you a bill of goods, that if your faith is great enough, somehow life's just wonderful. And if you are grieving, you just don't have the right amount of faith. And I think that's just a falsehood that's been preached far too often. And it really ends up hurting people.
So one of the things that we talked about is there is no real training in seminary. There's no training on Well, specifically, we're talking about widows here, but there's no training on how do you start a widows ministry? How do you serve widows? Is that correct?
That's pretty much correct. Seminary focuses on biblical languages, theology, the Bible, but there's no nuts and bolts of how do you actually minister to people.
Hmm.
And when I met you 21 years ago, I was a fresh pastor out of seminary, and it was like, here's this young widow, and what do I say? What do I do? Because you were very angry and you had a lot of questions and you were very angry at God. But seminary doesn't prepare you for that. And because it doesn't, in seminary, I had a generic course on grief, but that doesn't really, widowhood is totally different because it is so life shattering. And the
Yes.
grief that we experience is unlike anything else. And seminary just doesn't train us for that. And because there's so little training, I think we avoid widows and widowers. I was often told, businesses give you 3 days to grieve. Why are you still acting the way you are? Uh, and I really, when I reached out to you in my widowhood, it was just to try to make sense of my sanity because everybody else around me was telling me I was crazy. Uh, but you had been on that journey, and you helped me through that. But yeah, seminary is it's neglectful when it comes to widows and widowers. There is no training of how to deal in that type grief.
So your schools on scriptures, and we can mention if you hear James 1:27, caring for orphans and widows, Isaiah 1, I think it's 17, be defenders for the widows. So you learn the scriptural content, but the application and how would you actually care for fatherless and widows, that is sort of left up to you in the field. And there are so few resources for places of worship. This is what I've learned over the last 20 years. Is it's the reason why we're working on a project together right now, because if we had this ability for places of worship to get an education, and one of the little books that I give away is Caring for Widows, um, it does help. But see, the biblical importance of it. You just don't know how to actually create it. And then there's, of course, the whole, really, widows want widow leaders of those small groups, and those are so rare to find. It's really kind of what we do here at Modern Widows Club, is create widow
I think
leadership
churches
leaders.
also get wrapped up in a, lack of better phrase, but a business model of
Hmm.
conversion, 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 and
Yes.
everything gets sucked into that model. And pretty soon, if you don't look up, you're never going to realize that widows don't need to be converted, they need to be healed. They need to be offered hope. And churches they're just not in that work anymore of actually helping people to heal. I started a group here at my church, and we deliberately made it a very secular experience. It's like, we're not here to convert you, we're not here to push theology or the Bible on you. We're just here because we've been through this, and we want to help you get through this. And the irony of that, even though I tell them, please don't join my church, nearly every single one of them have ended up joining my church because they found healing. And that's what they were looking for. And I think in seminary and in churches in particular, we've lost our focus on actually healing people. Many of the grief programs I've run across, they're not really grief programs. They're 6-week
Yes.
programs to try to convert you at
That's
the end of it to a particular faith or denomination. And that's pretty tragic because I've dealt with a lot of my widows who have been through that, and
Mhm.
they literally feel that they were abused and taken advantage of. And they were deeply hurt.
Yes.
And it took a lot of work. And they ended up joining my church, which was totally against my will. I
We
don't want you to.
Yeah, we hear that too, here, that they're very vulnerable when they enter some of those grief related programs, and it really becomes, a few weeks in, we want to find you a place here at our church, and we want you to convert, and
They're
it really feels disingenuous, because the trust has to be built first, and that's why your group is so successful, is because you allowed that healing to be the focus, and finding the hope in the healing, and then it allowed them a safe place to want to hear more, if that's what they wanted, right? It really does need to be the person's choice.
So
You know,
their widows are looking for hope.
yes.
All too often, churches are looking just for another convert.
Hmm.
And that's abusive. Those two things do not match, and it's abusive. And it's almost like another secondary grief of, I came to you for hope, and all you did was try to tell me what's wrong with me and convert me.
And this is the complete opposite. If you look at what Jesus stood for, and even what he did, and what he asks us to do, it's the opposite.
Yes. Jesus was all about healing. He didn't ask you what your faith was. He didn't ask you what church you belong to. It was always reaching out to offer you hope and healing.
That's right.
And those stories are repeated throughout the Gospels.
That's right. And so we kind of talked a little bit about, because I always ask the strangest questions, I feel like, but I do think that they're questions that resonate with people. And my question was, how did Jesus become so compassionate to widows? And that brought us to the conversation of, well, look who he asked for. The very last woman that he even asked to be cared for was a young widow who happened to be his own mother, Mary, that he asked his beloved disciple to care for, John. And these were his last breaths, that he actually had this deep empathy and compassion for what was going to happen to this young widow.
I think you've asked the question of churches before, who's the greatest widow's advocate? And it's Jesus, because his mother, Mary, we know from the Bible that at age 12, Mary and Joseph are still together, because there's a story about Jesus as the 12-year-old boy in the temple. Sometime after that, Joseph dies. He disappears from the narrative. So Mary becomes a widow. And I believe that she became a very young widow, because in the Gospels, you will run across of stories of how Jesus's hometown deals with him. And they will often derogatorily say to him, "Oh, there goes Mary's son." Well, nobody in the ancient world was addressed that way. You were the son of a father. But by calling him the son of Mary, I think they were making aspersions about her being a widow and Jesus not having a father. So I think from a very early age, Jesus knew the pain that Mary experienced as a widow, because at the end of his life, as he's dying and taking his last breaths on the cross, the last thing on his mind is he turns to the beloved disciple and he says, "Please take care of my mother," because he had spent his whole life taking care of her. And he knew that without a male presence in the ancient world, she would be totally destitute and alone. And that was his last act: take care of my mother, who's a widow. And so I take that very seriously, that if that was such a concern for Jesus, it's got to be a concern for us, because we just turn a blind eye to widows and widowers in our congregations.
I know my first experience of becoming widowed, and I walked, there was actually a widow's luncheon. That's what was offered at my place of worship. And I remember going, and it was not the experience I expected to have, which I'm not sure what I was expecting, but I walked in, and because I was 37 years old and my daughters were 2 and 4, Of course, I was wondering, is there childcare? And also they thought I was a volunteer. And I understood once I went into the room, because there was honestly probably a 30-year gap, 20 to 30-year gap between me and the women that were in the room. And I thought, oh my gosh, like no one here is going to understand that I run a big business, and I have 2 daughters, and I don't know how I'm going to do this without any family in town. And so, that was really powerful. But we started talking about the early church and how widows used to be treated, right? Because if Jesus cared so much because he had this experience with his own mother being a young widow, that really did direct the early church and how widows were treated.
Yes, the book of Acts, which is the second half of Luke's gospel, tells the story of the church. And one of the first problems they have, where they have to really forces them to organize, is how are they going to take care of their widows? And the disciples are overwhelmed. And so they basically call up some people to be deacons, that you will focus on taking care of our widows. And I think that's very illuminating, that in this early movement, there must have been so many widows attracted to the early church that it's becoming an overwhelming challenge to take care of them all. And so the disciples, this is their first act. I guess you could call it the first church council. Let's get together. Let's figure out how we're going to tackle this issue of our widows and how to care for them. And that's the very first church act of, here's what we're going to do. And they divide it up and they plan out their mission of how they will care for all these widows. I think that tells us that widows flocked to the church because they were finding meaning and hope and healing. And this was the place to go to. So I think when you read in between the lines and actually ask when you're reading these biblical stories, what's going on here in the background? A lot of this starts making a lot of sense, especially that concern for widows.
So that whole idea of James 1:27, practice caring for the fatherless and the widows, is you probably know it better than I do, just about practicing true religion.
That's
what
What is pure religion?
Yes.
James, that's at the very beginning of his letter as he's addressing a church. And I mean, seriously, what he's saying is the mission of the church is to care for widows and orphans. And he lays that out at the very beginning. And it's like, if that is the mission, the primary focus, why is it today that when I look around, there are no widows groups in churches? There aren't even any books and resources geared for Christianity and widows. And I think that's a sad indictment of our church today, that we've forgotten our purpose and mission.
I also think that churches and pastors think someone else is doing it.
Yes.
And what we have found here at Modern Widows Club, just by accident, because we just started, 100, list of where our widows, if they were Catholic or if they were Methodist or if, they were needed a Jewish synagogue. We just innocently started a list, and we were blown away by the absence of even one thing, maybe a lunch once a year, or I mean, honestly, they were so excited to hear about us because there was, and some women that answered the phone were widows themselves. They were volunteering and they themselves were looking for someplace. So I think that there is this idea that someone else is doing it. And I have approached some pastors and asked, why don't you start something? And they're just like, oh, we send them somewhere else. Like your church.
The assumption is that's what the family and the kids are for.
Okay.
They don't care, because the assumption is widows are 80 and 90 years old, which we know not to be true, but that's the perception in churches, and we leave that for the kids. Well, as a widow or widower, I would not want my kid, no matter how old, thinking they were responsible for me. I need I need fellow widows and widowers, people who've been on that journey. I need a church that has the spiritual guidance that I'm looking for. I need a place to heal. I can't be expected to put that on my child. Help me to heal. I
Well,
need my church family. A few
and
years ago, we celebrated International Widows Day at the church, and we invited every widow to come up and place a votive on the altar. And when they started walking up, there were audible gasps in the audience of people going, "Oh my God, I didn't realize you were a widow." Even though they knew their husband or wife had died years ago, the just the understanding that there are that many widows and widowers in our church,
that's
and
correct.
we just don't see them, or we assume they're over it. And that's another bad assumption that churches make theologically, that uh, the loss of a spouse is something you just get over eventually, because you never do.
That's right. It is a lifelong process. And we know that the first year, really, you're in brain fog. And this is when the majority of help shows up. But it's really the second year and the third year. And how do I rebuild my life? Because I am experiencing what we call these secondary losses, which could be, the loss of your best friend, your confidant, your intimate partner, your the person who helps you with your finances, who helps you around the house. All of these things were tied to this one person. And when I found out that the average age of an American widow is 59 years old, I just about fell out of my seat. I was 37. How old were you?
40.
40. Okay. So, we're the people who have brought this number down. And actually that number is getting less and less because of male suicide. But when you look at, places of worship that are so getting remarried is really what most people encourage me to do in a place of worship, which they're assuming there is someone there for me to remarry. You've remarried, I have not. But 70% of married women will become widowed. That is like never mentioned in marriage classes. That is never mentioned in classes, in men's groups or men's events. We're talking about a large number of women that are going to statistically become widows.
I've I've now included that in marriage counseling.
Yes,
Just something I think churches and pastors neglect is, you need to have the talk of someday you are going to be separated by death. That's just that's just the reality. And you need to have that conversation now at the beginning, because that's going to bring you closer together and give you a stronger marriage. But so many of us in this culture, we deny death's reality.
yes,
And I think the church denies it too. Uh,
really.
we're guilty of that. We don't want to talk about it. And when somebody is grieving, we want to just kind of shove them aside. Yeah, we'll be there for the funeral and we'll support you those first 3 days. But after that, you really just need to move on. And I think the sad reality is a lot of churches do push marriage on women, because that's a way to get them out of the way. We don't have to deal with their grief now. They're married. Well, even though I am remarried, I still deal with the grief. It's always there. There's an emptiness it's
That's
not
right.
going to go away.
Well,
And
and your daughter, Grace, she lost her mother.
yeah,
This is this is part of what's really hard for people to understand, is that, my daughter got engaged this weekend. Her dad wasn't there. She's 25 years old. I stood there alone in that moment with friends of the family, but still, you know,
even if you were remarried and the stepfather was absolutely wonderful, there's still the emptiness of my dad is not here.
yes, yes.
And churches seem to have the attitude of just get them remarried and this problem solved. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not that simple. Grief doesn't work that way.
So how are we going to, so if it's not taught in seminary, and then there's not very much application. I'm acting naive here, right? Because I don't know what you do as far as conventions. And I mean, when pastors get together, where is the place where we can make some kind of change where education is brought into these circles for pastors so that then they can serve widows better when it does happen, because it's not an if, it's when.
Right. And that's a tough question, because I've asked my colleagues, I've asked my partners in ministry around this community, please start a widows group. And
Mhm.
they will often say, well, that's your thing. We'll send them to you. I said, no, they need their own support group in their church, in their faith family. They don't need to come to me. I said, you just need to open your eyes and see that they're there and offer them something.
Yes.
They just want to be seen. And I think the church is no longer seeing widows. And even in how we look at the Bible, I mean, it's amazing to me. There's so many stories of widows there if you would open your eyes. And I don't think churches are doing that anymore. I mean, I ask people a lot, do you realize Mary was a widow? And they go, oh, hadn't thought about that.
Correct.
But there's other women in the Bible that are widows.
Yeah, well, we talked about Mary Magdalene and your thoughts on Mary Magdalene, which I thought was very fascinating as well.
Yes. So I believe Mary Magdalene is a widow. She goes, her last name is her hometown. So it's like, it'd be like Blake of Eureka Springs, but it's Mary of Magdala. You don't get that ascription unless you're very wealthy and very powerful and have a high position. We know Mary was very powerful and wealthy because she funded the disciples throughout their 3 years of ministry. She was the financial backer. She also followed them wherever they went. Now, in the ancient world, women were either single, living at home under the authority of their father, or they were married and at home living under the authority of their husband. Mary has a whole lot of independence and power and wealth. She is obvious. The only way she could have gotten that is for her husband to have died, and she inherited his belongings and his position and power. That's the only way she would have the freedom to support these 12 disciples and to follow them all over the countryside. And there are other Marys that are hanging around Jesus that seem to also have this freedom. I believe they're also widows, because that's the only way they would have that liberty to do that, because in the ancient world, widowhood either gave you destitute poverty, or it actually gave you the freedom to live outside of a man's authority, either your father or your husband. And so Jesus has surrounded himself with women who have a lot of independence and liberty. And I imagine that's because they're widows.
Well, and I love that story. And it starts to make sense when you explain it that way, because you have to take yourself back into ancient times, right? I mean, it's not like me, who had a career and, raised my daughters and worked. It's different times.
And
Um,
it's sad. Church tradition has erased Mary Magdalene.
mm,
I think many of your audience will understand. Often in churches, Mary is portrayed as the prostitute who was possessed by demons. That is not Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is the woman who is known by her hometown. She is financing the disciples' ministry, and she is very independent and very powerful. But the church has erased her memory by equating her to a prostitute whom Jesus healed of demonic possession. And that's two different stories. That
mm,
is not Mary Magdalene. And I think that's rather sad that we've done that.
yes.
because we've silenced her voice and the voice of widows.
Well, we look at all these really powerful widowed stories, right? There's Ruth and Naomi, which is extraordinary. And then we also have the widow's mite. Tell that story about how much, here's what I know about widows. They really do give all to meaning and purpose. This is why a lot of people come to Modern Widows Club. These are women who do want to be purposeful. They do want to honor the love, and they use that as fuel to find their purpose. And so it makes so much sense to me for the church to care about widows, but I don't see it happening as much as I would like it to be happening. And that's why I have these deep conversations with you, because I don't understand the historic and I don't understand the scriptures as deeply as you do. But share the story about the widow's mite and how Jesus made a point of talking about her giving.
So the Jewish religion, the Hebrew religion of Jesus's day, heavily emphasized the care of widows and orphans.
Yes.
Throughout the Old Testament. I mean, there are scripture after scripture about the importance of caring for widows. This widow comes to the temple because this is her spiritual home. This is the place where she's found healing and hope. And she drops in the coffers everything she has, what's called the widow's mite, which is the smallest unit of monetary denomination in the ancient world. She throws it all in, and Jesus stops the disciples and said, "Did you just see that?" And of course, they remember seeing the rich guy throw in the gold coins because that impressed them. But he goes, no, I'm talking about the widow who gave everything, because she knew this was a place of hope and healing, and she wanted others to be able to find it too. And so she was going to give everything she had to make sure that the next widow would also be cared for. And Jesus held her up as the example. This is a true giver. That other guy was just throwing money around. Focus on her, because she is interested in helping other widows. And so that was his illustration that he wanted them to pay attention to.
It's I know the experience of widowhood and giving all that you have is it's a grace-filled experience. I know what this is like to, when I started Modern Widows Club, I had zero funds, right? I was raising children. I was running a home. I was running a business. I was tapped about as much. And I remember thinking, no, God, don't choose me. Like, I'm not connected. I do not have wealth. I do not have the energy. I don't have nothing that I could put towards this. And yet, I was moved to just mentor two ladies, and it turned into where we are today, serving 40,000 widows and, meeting other people like you who actually do care about widows, because they are terribly forgotten around the world. And it's not just places of worship, it's governments, it's our social systems. It's widows are rarely recognized in policy changes or economic empowerment. We work with international widows organizations, and we know what is happening out there. We know how little support there is. And so maybe we're a little bit dangerous in a sense that we understand the neglect. But I think that places of worship with some education and with some guidance, well, I think more would want to actually care about widows. And I'm just curious what your thoughts on that would be.
You had asked the question, are pastors and churches practicing true faith if they're not taking care of widows? I just know from my experience, I didn't want any widow or widower to go through what I went through, of being completely alone, thinking I'm crazy, of people being kind of nasty to me because they didn't understand what I was going through. So I started this support group to help other widows find hope and healing. But in that process, they have come and they found the hope, they found the healing, but they found growth and they found leadership. And now 4 years into this, most of my missions and ministries, most of the work of the church is being done by these widows and widowers who I told, please don't join my church. We're not here for that. They joined in spite of me, and they've become my leaders, and they are feeding the multitudes. They are out soothing people's griefs. They often beat me to the homes of people who have lost their spouse because they're going to take care of everybody. And they have transformed this church. And I had told them, please don't join. And I think if we would take that seriously, of taking care of widows, you're going to discover widows and widowers have been through a life-shattering experience. And once you heal from that,
Yes.
There's nothing else going to break you in life. And they become the pillars of strength in your church. Mary Magdalene, I think, was an amazing, extraordinary woman. I think Mary, the mother of Jesus, was an extraordinarily strong woman. The church was built around these women. And I think we're missing out on a golden opportunity if pastors and churches don't take widows seriously, because this is your future. This is where your strength and miracles will come from. Because once they've found the hope and healing, there's no stopping it. And I think
That is very true. The restoration that is felt, right? It's external and it's internal. And the power of that is really what I kind of am in awe of, that I get to work around so many widows day in, day out. And this is what I experience and try to share with places of worship and pastors. And it really kind of just is like this mystery, like, what are you talking about? And so you explained it really well about the blessing that comes back to the church, because if it was good enough for Jesus to launch the early church on and show such importance to these women, he knew something. Right?
he knew it because he lived it. He saw his mom live it and saw the pain she suffered when Joseph died.
That's
And
right.
I think as a child, you never forget that. And, you read the Bible, you read those stories. He was always concerned with widows. And the early church in the book of Acts was deeply concerned with widows. The Old Testament community is of faith that God wanted people to build, the covenant community. That was the foundation. Take care of widows and orphans. And they did that. And when they didn't do that, they discovered they lost everything. But when they did it, they had everything. And I'm discovering here, just out of this support group, the power of when people find hope and healing, they are transformed into something else. And there's just no stopping them. And I think when churches and pastors kind of shunt widows to the side, or hey, that's for their children to take care of, when they turn the blind eye, when they don't offer the hope or healing, well, they never find it. And then your church loses out of the gifts that they could offer that would transform everything you're doing.
I agree. And whenever a place of worship or a pastor reaches out to me, one of the things I always suggest is there is this thing called International Widows Day. It's on June 23rd, and maybe you could have a luncheon, or maybe you could recognize and share, like you said, come light a votive at the front of the church. I think the biggest issue is people don't know who is widowed in their places of worship. And so that is usually the first thing that I ask is, how many widows do you have? And then when they ask me, how would you know that? Right. And I'm like, well, there are about 7, there's some dilemmas on like how many widows it would be, but I would say expect it to be about at least 10 to 15% of your women's population. And so they may not know, because sometimes they want to do a luncheon and they're like, how many people should I plan for? And I'm like, well, since you don't have a little status box that says widowed on your information sheet, and you don't have a tally of how many widows you actually know, because widows know widows. And once you tell someone there's something at a place of worship, let's say a luncheon or something, they're going to tell another widow. So that's just the network that widows have. So I always just suggest, why don't we start here? Why don't we first try to find out how many widows I know, because you talk about it in your sermons, and you have a database where you can actually share. But first you have to find out where they are, and then just invite them to something. And then when you bring the widows together, just listen, because the widows will share with you, just like probably Mary and Mary Magdalene did, some of the wisdom that they actually have to share. And it will naturally, like you did, let's just pick a date and a time, and we're going to start. And then that's how it organically begins,
I
right?
think the simplest thing churches could do is to recognize International Widows Day and
Yes.
just have a simple ritual of
Yep.
inviting the widows to come forward and place a candle on the altar.
Yep.
They've already been and survived so much. They will organize organically. They will see each other and say, hey, let's get together, let's do something.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science, it's not deep theology. You don't have to be a widow or widower to enable this. Just create the space one Sunday morning and
That's right.
encourage them to get together. And I think that's your basic first step to a widow's ministry. They'll take care of it.
I agree. And this has been such an amazing conversation. And I know that we're going to be having a lot more, because we could go on, and we were trying to keep this, as short as possible, because it's just really kind of the first introduction and having a conversation. I know we're going to do a lot more, Blake, but thank you so much for just sharing your heart for widows and widowers, and for the work that you're doing with them.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, for all you've done for me and for widows around the world. It's been a great blessing.
Oh, absolutely. We'll put some information in this video, but thank you all for attending, and give us your thoughts about this. We really want to continue this conversation. Thanks.